Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to a new report on the Biden administration's attempt to supercharge the Internal Revenue Service. This is an analysis from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. It is titled The Inflation Reduction Act, Continued Assessment of Transformation Efforts. And Monet, you have dug into this report. Can you give us a sense of what it says?
Well, TIGTA, as it's known, this Inspector General at Treasury that oversees the IRS, is checking in to gauge its progress on implementing certain changes that President Biden asked them to make when they dumped a new $80 billion worth of funding into the agency through the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. So it's now been about a year and a half since that point, and the IRS is supposedly supposed to be progressing along its benchmarks, and yet the new report shows that they've been sluggish at best in implementing some of these changes. So the big change that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and President Biden urged the IRS to do was to focus much more on auditing high-income taxpayers. These are people who are earning more than $1 million a year. And the idea is that the U.S. has a massive tax gap. The amount that it is technically owed by all taxpayers, particularly from income and capital gains taxes, versus the amount that it collects because these wealthy taxpayers are engaged in all sorts of tax avoidance, some legal and some illegal. And so the idea was that they were going to hire a new massive force of auditors to be looking into the taxes of these high-income people. And yet, the report from the Inspector General found that as of the most recent filing season, so that would have been people filing taxes in 2023 for their 2022 income, about 63% of all of the new audits were on taxpayers who earned less than $200,000 a year. And so that's a very big majority. Of course, that is the majority of taxpayers as a whole, but their entire idea was that they were going to focus less on the middle class and more on these wealthy taxpayers. That doesn't seem to have been the case at all so far. And one of the reasons for that is probably that they're struggling to actually hire this massive new group of auditors who they wanted to be focusing on the high income taxpayers. And so for whatever reasons internally, they haven't been able to actually implement these changes. And it just makes you wonder what exactly is being done with all those billions of dollars that they can't even really begin to change their focus in the way that they promised to do.
That struggle to hire is one of the most fascinating pieces of this, to my eye. Here's a line from a report in the trade publication Government Executive recently. IRS had planned to bring on 3,833 revenue agents in fiscal 2023. But in the first 6 months, officials had recruited just 34. Kim, I think this is fascinating because it's another example of how easy it is for Congress to pass a bill and say, we're going to transform this agency and we're going to make it do X, Y, and Z. And then it's another thing when somebody who is in that agency has to actually try to make that happen in the real world.
Yes, and it would be nice too, if the IRS would be honest about the real world complications of this instead of going on and suggesting that this all is feasible and it just needs to have a little bit more time. One of the things that made me laugh recently is Republicans have obviously been keen to try to claw back some of this money because it was an extraordinary amount of money for an agency that has a dismal record. And I think the thing that frustrated Republicans the most was that a great deal of it had been earmarked for these increased audits, when in fact, if you talk to taxpayers or if you look at the taxpayer advocate and TIGTA, who have written endless reports about this, what people would like to see is just that the IRS try to start dealing with its extraordinary backlog, try to start dealing with some of its long hold times when people call in. But because the IRS wanted to be seen to be fighting back against the Republican effort to get some of this money back, and by the way, Republicans have successfully clawed back about 20 billion of that 80 billion that'll be cut over the 10 years. But they put out a report, the IRS, earlier this year saying, you know, our program is just going to be great. And yeah, it's off to a slow start. We're probably only going to raise about $100 million from auditing and going after wealthy people this fiscal year. We're going to stay on track, and starting by 2030, we're going to claw back from wealthy people in audits $8 billion a year. I mean, it was a stunning amount of money. They suggested that they were going to collect something like $561 billion in taxes that should have come into the government and weren't because of this extraordinary audit program that it's going to put into place. Well, if Monet's numbers that he just cited are correct, you know, they're down now to a few more months left in this fiscal year. It seems pretty hard that they're going to hit even that $100 million goal, much less the bigger ones they have going forward. And I think the thing that ought to disturb people is, in its rush to try to hit those goals, that the IRS is just going to further clamp down on middle-class Americans and even lower-income Americans as they try to hit those numbers.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.